Hey, good afternoon, good morning, good evening. Whatever time zone you are in, great to be with you again. I'm Peter Rushton from Intent-Based Leadership International, and I'm joined today by one of my colleagues, Chuck Dunphy. Good afternoon to you, Chuck.
Hi, Peter. How you doing today?
Doing pretty well, and all the better for having you with us today, Chuck.
Very much.
One of the things we want to talk about is Chuck's experience on the famous submarine, the Santa Fe. Very much the birthplace of intent-based leadership. And so over the course of the next half hour or so, we're going to be talking to Chuck about some of his experiences, what made it different, what were some of the practices that emerged in the use of intent-based leadership, and how might those apply to our everyday work. So thanks very much, Chuck. Tell us a little bit about your background to start off with.
So I was in the Navy for 20 years as a Navy Supply Corps officer. So I handled all logistics and contracting and parts, all those kinds of fun things. And one of my tours was on the USS Santa Fe with Captain David Marquet.
How long had you been in the Navy before you joined the Santa Fe?
Before that, it was just about 4 years at that point. A couple of years of that was in training. And then 2 years was on the USS Curtis Wilbur, which was a guided missile destroyer out of Yokosuka, Japan.
So did you choose to go underwater, as it were, or do you not get a choice and you get the finger of fate pointing and saying, you're ready for diving?
No, you absolutely get a choice. Everyone in the submarine force is a volunteer. As a supply corps officer, seems there might be a little pushing to say, hey, you would be great in the submarine force. It's independent duty for a supply officer. You're the only supply officer on the submarine, so you don't have anybody to talk to or bounce anything off of. And they may tell you would be great for that, but you still have to volunteer to go on a submarine. Everybody on a submarine at that point.
I guess that's reassuring. So you were in the Navy for 4 years. Tell us a little bit about the approach to leadership that you'd experienced up until the point that you got the order to join the Santa Fe.
So up until that point, it was very directive. It was very, you got an order, you were given parameters and told, go carry out these orders. And you didn't think too much of it. I mean, that's what you thought leadership was. That's the Navy somewhat drills that into your head, that as officers, you give orders, you give instructions. You tell people what to do and when to do it, and they go carry out those orders to the best of their ability. So you think it's very normal, but it wasn't always the most comfortable thing. I always call it leadership by volume, which just meant if you had a nice big boomy voice, people probably would listen.
Yeah, so it's that kind of give good order. Good leaders give good orders, right? Bad leaders give bad orders.
Very much
that
so.
was the assumption.
Very much so.
I'm interested, had you heard anything about what was happening on board the Santa Fe before you arrived? Or were you going in with the assumption, yeah, it's another Navy posting, what's going to be different?
Yeah, it was probably that one. It was probably, I had not heard of the Santa Fe. Probably by the time I was in the pipeline, David was probably on board, but he was only on board a very short amount of time, kind of once I got orders and once I got into the submarine pipeline. And that was going to mean I had to go off to training, and there's a whole submarine school where you learn how to be a submariner.
And so once you're on board and you're getting to experience the kind of day-to-day routines, when did it become apparent to you that this might be a different way, this might be a different type of teamwork and a different type of leadership?
I would say almost immediately. David had been there a little while, and things had started to change. Definitely the idea that that he was giving his intent, here's what I want to do, here's what we're trying to accomplish, and your job was to figure out, how would I be a part of that, and what do I need to accomplish to make that happen?
Yeah, so I think that's a really important aspect, isn't it? That there's two aspects to the intent. That the leader gives the intent, this is what we're trying to achieve, and the team then plays back, this is the way in which we're going to do it. But the team or the individual or the officer then determines the method by which you achieve the goal, rather than the leader or the senior commander saying, this is what we need to do and this is how we're going to do it.
Yes, you were the one that was going to figure out what do you need to do. But as a crew, we were helping everybody figure out where did you fit in to the process at large, which I think really helped people understand, hey, here's where I fit in. Here's why I'm important. Here's why what I'm doing has value. And it was really important that I understood everybody else's pieces so that I knew where I fit in and what was I waiting on to get my job accomplished, and then so on.
Now, I understand that relatively early on in your time with the Santa Fe, you had a special guest join the ship for a little while. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So right as really I got to the Santa Fe, and my very first underway, we had Dr. Stephen Covey on board, which was fascinating. He was a fascinating person, and it was interesting to have him there and listen to what he had to say.
So I think in David's first book, Turn the Ship Around, Dr. Covey wrote the foreword, and in it he talks about this being the most empowering environment or empowered team that he'd ever experienced. What was he seeing? What was happening there that made him draw that conclusion?
To be honest, it was a very simple underway. Looking back on it, it was my first, so I was excited just to get underway on the submarine. But it was a very normal underway. All we were doing is we were sailing from Pearl Harbor over to Lahaina in Maui. It was a day cruise, but not only was Stephen Covey on board, but it was a Tiger cruise, which means lots of family members were on board. My father was on board.
Mm-hmm.
So there was a lot going on that way, but you could just see Dr. Covey taking it all in. He wasn't talking a lot. It wasn't like he was trying to tell everybody, well, you should do it this way or that way. He was just soaking it all in and listening to how everybody was interacting with each other, how the officers were interacting with the chiefs and the crew. And it was, looking back on it, it was really interesting to see just how he was soaking it in.
And I think my sense is that it had quite a profound impact on Dr. Covey. And he was so curious that he wanted to understand and almost codify what was happening, what was the language which was being used, how were the team talking to each other. And so he and David sat down during or at the end of the visit and came up with what now we know as the ladder of leadership.
Yeah, absolutely. So we got underway from Pearl Harbor. We have certain things that we're going to do. We're going to submerge the ship. Everybody's family's on board. So you want to do some of the cool Navy stuff that we can do on a submarine. But once we surfaced and we're getting ready to pull into Lahaina, David and Dr. Covey were up in the sail. So kind of up here, if you see the picture of the submarine. And that's when Dr. Covey kind of turned to David and was like, I think I've figured out how you guys do this. And during that conversation, they went through and they put together the ladder of leadership as a team. They turned it really into a simple, logical process that they could do. And, from the tell me what to do, tell me what you see, tell me what you think, what do you want to do? What do you intend to do? What have you done? And David tells a very funny story during his keynotes where, they came up with those 6 steps and Dr. Covey puts his hand down in his head and David's thinking like, oh God, I think he's seasick or he's not feeling well. And he, asks Dr. Covey, are you okay? And Dr. Covey just says, I'm really a 7 guy. We need a 7th step here. And that's where they have kind of I've done and I've been doing. And we talk about that when we do our workshops, kind of what the difference is. And everybody's got their opinion, but it really started that.
Yeah, I sometimes think that level 7 of I've been doing is I find out by accident what's been going on. So can you tell us a little bit more in terms of in that environment? One of the things that I think sometimes gets missed is what does intent really mean? When somebody says, I intend to do this, is it a kind of, I'm going to do it over the course of the next few months, or I'd like to do this? Can you give us an example of what using intent would mean in that environment on the submarine?
So the basic example that I use all the time when I'm talking to people is the difference between Captain requests permission to get the submarine underway. Captain, I intend to get the submarine underway. Requesting permission, kind of like it starts a checklist and everybody on the crew would have their portion of the checklist and you're just going down and you're checking things off. I was thinking about this and it's it really does make you feel good. Everybody likes to check things off as they go, but that becomes the goal, to just check the things off. The big difference that I found is when you said, "Hey, I intend to get the submarine underway," that really put you responsible for it. That put you as the officer of the deck, as the crew member who was doing their part. Hey, I intend to do this to get the submarine underway. It put you in a position where you had to think, what am I doing and how is that affecting the evolution, the process of getting the submarine underway? And it wasn't that you couldn't go talk to David as an officer in my case, or if you were a junior enlisted person, you couldn't talk to your supervisor and say, hey, what about this or what about that? But the real benefit of it is it turned that conversation from a very transactional, do this, this, and this, to a very mentorship conversation. Make sure you're thinking about this and make sure you're thinking about that. And, he would tell you, that's really good. That's a really good start. But don't forget about these things as well, if there was other things. And the more you did it, quite honestly, the less David talked and the faster the evolution got, because he trusted that you knew it, because you would say, "Captain, I intend to get the submarine underway. The ship's rigged for dive. All crew members are on board. The tugs are alongside. The reactors started. All the people on the bridge and in control are standing by." So you would learn to, you would go through those steps. You would go through the ladder of leadership almost and say, "Hey, here's what I see. Here's what I think. This is what I want to do." So that's what's happening. But the big thing
So I
is,
think
I'm sorry, as a leader, you have the opportunity to still weigh in, but you're stepping back and you're letting the team run with it, and which gives a lot of confidence to the team that they know what's going on and they know what they're doing.
So one of the things I think people find hard to get their head around or well, I'm not sure whether it will work for me, is obviously Dr. Covey himself talked about this as the finest example of an empowered team that he'd seen. But you're operating in a submarine in one of the most regulated environments that I could possibly imagine. And lots of organizations, whether it's nuclear power or financial services or anything to do with energy production and so forth, operate in these very highly compliance, highly process-based environments. How does this idea of giving people more control work in that environment where you don't want somebody running off and saying, "Oh, I've got an idea about starting up the reactor in a different way"? So can you tell us a little bit more about how intent works in that highly processed, highly compliance-based organization or based environment?
I think in those environments, it's even more important, because that traditional model of leadership where I tell you what to do and you do it is predicated on the fact that you know everything and that you know that everything that's going on. And you obviously, that's almost impossible to have you don't have complete vision on a submarine, in a hospital, at a nuclear power plant. You can't be everywhere at once. You have to rely on the people that are in their different places at their different stations to do what they're supposed to be doing. And if you're trying to be the all-knowing, all-powerful leader and telling everybody what to do, I think you're just setting yourself up for failure.
So the shift in terms of what happened wasn't necessarily, the processes were not torn up and things done differently. It was more about who was owning the process and owning the decision as to why things were happening and when they were happening. And the thinking shifted from the captain taking all of the burden, making all of the decisions, to the crew being active and expecting to be active and expecting to make decisions.
Yeah, absolutely. There's no way to have the whole book memorized or the many books memorized. So you need everybody to know their portion of the book, know where they fit into that, and to be able to speak up and even to some extent just completely stop an evolution if they see something wrong. And the 5 minutes that it might take you to figure out is that what you need to be doing now could save you hours, days, or weeks, even if you waited another 10 or 15 minutes down the road, because if something obviously bad happens, you're in a world of hurt.
I think there are also probably other examples of where the compliance aspect has crept into every element of the way in which the ship was operating, to the point in which effectively control was being taken away from tasks which people who were doing the work were much more capable of doing. I'm thinking of I've heard you tell the story previously about what happened in the kitchen. I wondered whether you can share a little bit more about that.
So I think you're talking about, I tell a story and I call it white rice or brown rice, which I like that story. And to David's credit, this was a great opportunity that he gave. Amazingly enough, the captain, he signs off on the menu, which sounds fine, but in reality, does he care? He probably cares. He cares that the crew is fed and the crew is happy, but on a day-to-day basis, he's not thinking. It's not the first thing he's thinking about when he's waking up in the morning, but he signs off on it. And all of the crew members that operate in the kitchen know that he does. And one of the fun things that we do when you're become a cook or a culinary specialist in the Navy, one of your first jobs is being the cook in the galley. The more senior you get, the more senior roles you get, which is, it's not the guy on the grill or working with the ovens. But on the menu that day, it just said rice, and it was probably close to kitchen breakfast or lunch. And the sailor who was making the meal that afternoon saw David in there, and he said, "Captain, do you want white rice or brown rice for dinner?" And I know what I would have done if I were in that situation. It probably would have been one of two things. One, I prefer white rice, so there's a good chance I just would have said, "Hey, let's make white rice. That's what I like." Or it might have been a little bit of a blow off. You know what? Just go ahead and pick one. It's fine. It's not going to matter. But to David's credit, when this sailor went in to the wardroom and asked David, "Do you want white rice or brown rice?" David turned him in. And the funny thing is on any given day, he doesn't remember this exactly, but he said, I'm not the right person to answer that question. You are. You know what you served last time. You know what's in the storeroom. You know what the crew likes based on the information that you have. I think you're the right person to make this decision. Now, to David, that was a quick, 20 or 30 seconds out of his life. But to this sailor, it was, he really had a moment where he was like, yeah, and you know what? And he went and looked those things up. What did we serve last time? When last time we served rice, what did we serve? Is there a way for me to figure out what the crew likes? And he figured out yes. And we keep records of how much leftovers were left from that meal. And he could see when we serve white rice, we don't normally have as much leftovers as we serve brown rice. And then he went and he asked the sailor in charge of the storeroom, how much rice do we have left of white or brown rice? And he thought about those things and he went and he made a decision and he learned the process of making a decision. And he went on to be a fabulous sailor. And it wasn't just that moment, but that moment really helped him think about, how do I affect the crew? How do I make a decision? Not just what decision was made, check.
So this idea, it's a perfect and lovely example of where, firstly, pushing authority to information. Who's got the data and who's got the information and the insight on who likes what? Perfect example. But also a good example in terms of how you're creating thinking within the team. I'd like to just test that and explore that a little bit more and think more about some of the perhaps high safety. That's a lovely example in terms of the food. Now let's think about some of where there's a little bit more jeopardy. There's a little bit more potential risk involved. One of the, I think, key stories that comes out of Turn the Ship Around is what happens when the petty officer makes a mistake with a circuit breaker, and it leads to a change in approach, which is called deliberate action. Can you tell us a little bit more about what deliberate action meant in that environment and what the benefit was of doing that?
So deliberate action for us was about vocalizing what you were about to do. If you were going to throw a switch, you said, I'm going to throw breaker 3 or 4, 1A. So you were vocalizing it. And the original idea is that then everybody around you could hear you say it and know you were, yep, you're supposed to throw that breaker, let him go ahead and do it. Or, oh, wait a minute, no, you're not supposed to do that. Wait. But the real benefit that we found was that it gave you that moment to think. Nobody ever had to step in once we started to do that, because you said, I'm about to throw breaker 1B, and you put your hand on the switch, but then because you started thinking about it, you saw there's the red tag that says, don't throw this switch. Somebody's doing maintenance or something down the line. So it gave you that moment to think and reflect on what you're doing. It got you out of process mode that we all get into, of checking things off on we do this and then this and then this. When that incident happened, and nobody was hurt, thank goodness, but the sailor freely admitted it. I saw the red tag. I know what red tags mean, but I was just, the checklist normally has you do this step, and then this step. And he was going down that checklist in his mind, and boom, boom, boom. And he admitted, I didn't pause to think about what I was doing, just this is the normal process, and I was doing. And so it had.
So sometimes, go ahead.
It had that very big impact of giving you that moment to think about what I'm doing. It engaged your brain, and it still gave everybody around you a chance to hear it, to know, I know what I'm doing next as soon as he throws that switch, but I know he's not supposed to throw that switch because there's a red tag there. So it gave that moment too. But the big benefit was the thinking.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes I think people hear deliberate action and equate that to other methods, such as the STAR, stop, think, act, review. I think what you've explained there is actually, it's more than that. By vocalizing it, you're doing two things. One is you are increasing your level of cerebral engagement with what's happening, but also you're giving the chance for somebody to listen and say, that sounds right, or it doesn't sound right. And in gesturing at the same time, it increases that level of engagement. So I think it's an advance on some of the traditional stop, think, act, review. In fact, the other thing I'm thinking about is the example of the Japanese railways, where they point and gesture and they call it out loud. But of course, so they're pointing at signals and highlight, there's a red signal, there's a yellow signal. Of course, the difference, I think, in the environment that you're talking about is that if you had somebody alongside you, you're inviting feedback. You're giving an opportunity for somebody to say, oh yeah, that sounds wrong. Or hold on, before you do that. So it's another mechanism, a bit like intent, of course, where when we share our intent or we share our actions and we vocalize it, you're actually creating the opportunity for somebody to say, well, hold on, are you sure at this point?
Exactly. And, the first response after that incident happened was add a supervisor to look over your shoulder while you're doing things. I'm not sure that ever would have worked, because it was 1, 2, 3. Would you have had time to even vocalize, don't hit that switch? I don't think you would, but this makes the person standing next to you the supervisor.
Yeah.
Which is the reaction that you want. You want everybody to weigh in. You don't want to have to add another level of supervision.
No, and when you add in that extra level of supervision, effectively, I think the message is that, well, somebody else is now responsible for it. But of course, if something goes wrong, then who's responsible for it? Okay, I'm also interested in, let's understand more about briefings. So every organization probably experiences or has to go through a point where there is some sort of team briefing ahead of a piece of work, ahead of a piece of project or an event or an activity which is taking place. Can you tell us about how briefings were turned around on board the Santa Fe?
So the basic example I use all the time is getting the ship underway. When I was on the Curtis Wilbur, it's a big evolution for a destroyer. It's a big evolution for any ship of almost any size. But as the conning officer on the ship, on the Curtis Wilbur, you got in front of all the officers and the chiefs and some of the enlisted sailors that were going to be involved in getting the ship underway. And you basically described out what was going to happen, what everybody was going to do, and how they were going to do it, which for you, fine. You have a very good sense of what's going on, but everybody else in the room, some are paying attention. Some are, well, he went through my portion of it, so now I'm going to just stand here and look at the wall. On the Santa Fe, we changed that to be, we called it certified, where everybody that was going to be involved in the evolution was there. And I would get up and I might start hey, we're going to get the submarine underway. I'm the conning officer. I'm going to be doing XYZ, and my orders are going to go to the helmsman. And then the helmsman would speak up and he would say, here's what I'm going to do. When I get an order from the conning officer, I'm listening for this, and then I'm going to carry out his order to change course or to change the speed. And what that ended up doing was that everybody in the evolution was an active participant in the certification. And if you were one of the officers sitting in the room, or even myself, you had a very good idea that they understood what their role was in getting the submarine underway. And you knew, any of the sailors that were in the space knew, oh, I'm waiting for, the navigator's going to say, us the deck, recommend changing course to, 090. Then the conning officer gets that order. And then he's going to tell the helm, come right to course 090. And so the helmsman knew, as soon as I hear the navigation table speak up, my ears perk up, because I know now I'm waiting on the officer of the deck. And then when he gives his orders, other people in the space are then reacting to what he's doing. And because everybody goes through that in the certification, everybody's very clear on what everybody's piece is. It's not just a passive, I'm there for the underway briefing, and once it's done, then I can go to lunch.
So certification, again, is another mechanism for injecting thinking and ownership into a process. I think, remember in the book, David says that he describes a situation where something hadn't gone quite according to plan, an activity hadn't gone quite according to plan, and afterwards there was a bit of an inquiry, well, what happened? And somebody said, yeah, Captain, nobody listens to those briefings, which I suspect is symbolic of a lot of meetings that happen where people switch in and switch out. And so moving to certification establishes an expectation you're all going to be contributing. You all need to prepare and to be talking about what you're going to be doing, what risks you're anticipating, what mitigation you're going to put in place, and how you'll respond in the event of something unexpected.
And yeah, I think to me, that's one of the most important things when you're thinking about safety, is having people engaged and understanding the full evolution. And then that gives you the confidence to speak up when you don't hear something, or you hear something that's wrong, to where in a lot of times people don't speak up. They'll say, well, that's not I don't do that. So somebody who does that's going to speak up. So everybody's waiting. Everybody's an active participant, not just, again, following the checklist to, if I hear this, when I hear the conning officer say, turn right to course 090, I turn right to course 090.
So I think one question we often get, and sometimes it kind of comes rooted in a little bit of, well, I'm not quite sure, is rooted in this. Well, the submarine is it's a completely unique working environment. You've got a group of people working and living together for about 6 months in extremely close quarters, probably more time on their hands for learning and so forth. What does that really have in common with most workplaces? So you've been there, you've served on the submarine, and you've come out and you've worked in different organizations. Tell us more about what's the actual reality. What do most organizations have in common with that team working in close quarters in the submarine?
And definitely a submarine is a unique environment that 99% of the population is never going to know about or anything. And it was a great place to be. I had so much fun. The common thing through every organization is people. And they don't change. And in as many organizations that I've been a part of, and now that I'm out of the Navy, and I'm seeing it in the different work that we do, all the problems I hear are all pretty common. People don't speak up. Leaders want more engagement, more accountability. They want those things. And that's no different if it's an IT organization or a hospital or a police department or a nuclear power plant or a nuclear submarine. we want those same things from our people. And that's the common theme throughout it. And the more I do this, the more I'm in a complete thought that that's the common factor throughout every organization around is we're all people.
So the Santa Fe in some ways was the petri dish of how a team works together. As you say, it's all about human connection and human communication. It was just done in a very intense environment on board the submarine, but all the principles still apply because it's all still about how do we engage, how do we take ownership, how do we talk to each other. I guess the great benefit of what happened on board the Santa Fe is it showed what could happen and gave us the practices that we can take away and apply in everyday organizations.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would say, look, if I can do it on a nuclear powered submarine, which again, you're absolutely right. It's one of the most highly regulated places that you will ever find. If it is not written down in a procedure, you don't do it. That was different than even the surface Navy that I had been involved in before. But the common thing throughout is just the people, and that if you can do it on a submarine, you can do it, I think, anywhere. I don't think that there's a place where intent-based leadership is not going to be.
That being said, when you talk to organizations and people who are interested in using this approach, what do you hear as being the main challenges that people have when implementing this approach?
The main challenges that I hear is leaders wanting accountabilities. It's the number one word that we hear all the time. And I don't really like it. I always ask them, tell me more about that, because I'm not 100% sure that accountability is just the right word. But I know from our perspective, after you've been there a little bit and you've started to dig into it, the real challenge in most organizations is the leaders themselves in trying to break the habits that they've created throughout a career and been successful. They've had successful careers up to that point, and either it could be their business, it could be a startup, it could be a police force, it could be a military organization, and you've spent 15, 20 years in the military up to that point. And so you think, rightfully so, that you've gotten there for a reason. But just because you've gotten there because of the leadership that you've done doesn't mean you can't improve and change your leadership style, because the times are changing, people are changing, technology is changing. Things are happening so much faster now from even when I was on the submarine. When I was on the submarine, we had one email address and they printed out the emails for everybody on the submarine and somebody handed them out. 5-10 years before that, you didn't have emails, you got a message. Your family could send 2 messages during the deployment to say, hi, how are you? This is what's going on. And if something really bad happened, you would give them somebody to talk to. But technology changes. The last deployment on the last ship that I was on, I sent 2 or 3 emails a day to my wife, and she got them and responded to them. Even if it was just, hey, good morning, had a good, slept well, hope you're having a great day. And you'd fire that off, and it went, and it got to her 5-10 minutes later. So, yeah.
So what I hear is that there are a couple of things to think about. The first is sometimes we hear leadership teams saying, oh, this would be great if they were able to embrace working with intent, and the they being the rest of the team, because the leader's frustration is almost this, why aren't they thinking like us? But actually the starting point is normally, what is it that you need to change in order to enable that thinking? And I agree with you so much in terms of the accountability aspect. And for me, I think again, one of the key, but sometimes maybe hidden learning points and impacts of what happened on board the submarine was about the culture of self-accountability, which was created, where people wanted to improve, not just prove their value. People felt comfortable to talk about what's gone well, but most critically, what could have been different. And so, yeah, our perspective is don't try and work on a culture where you're holding people to account. Work on developing a culture where people want to hold themselves to account. Yeah, so let's finish with the final question then. If you had any advice in terms of a leader, a team wanting to get started with intent-based leadership, what would you do? Imagine you're having the conversation, what would you advise them to do at this point?
So what would I advise people to do is, the first thing is you can do a little bit of research. David's put out a lot of information about intent-based leadership. There's a great video called What is Leadership that will give you the 10-minute version of the story of the Santa Fe. There is a lot of information out there, but the biggest thing is, call, ask some questions. Probably the first thing I would like to do with any organization is I want to go. I want to do a little bit of a workshop. I want to teach people kind of those first few things of intent-based leadership, because I think even at that level, we can make small changes that will have big impacts in your organization. And then if you find that this works for you, give me a call back, and there's a lot more we can do. I think, getting in and doing it. We say a lot, leadership is like a sport. It's something you have to practice every day. It's not a history class. It's not a science class where you read it and then you move on. It's that repetition that's going to make it become second nature and make it something that you're going to do every day. And that's when culture changes, is when you can change people's actions. And we've found that the language we use has a huge impact on that. And it's easy to practice.
Yeah, I think there's a kind of short and a long-term perspective here. The longer-term perspective is, as you say, learning to be an intent-based leader is a bit like learning a sport or a language. So it takes time and practice. It does take time. But there are certainly things that you can start off with and start to see, does this work for us? So I think the benefit of the type of introduction workshop that you and I have been running is it gives an opportunity for leadership teams to think about, is this going to work for us? Is this the right thing for us? And even if at this point it might be, yeah, maybe, but we're not quite sure, they're still walking away with a bunch of new practices and things that they can start working.
And one of the things that I think you do really well, the whole team does very well, is we're breaking these things down into manageable things that you can do. It's not about giving people War and Peace and say, read this and start doing it. It's about giving people the 3x5 card. I can remember that. I can remember the ladder of leadership and how I want to have that kind of conversation of, tell me more about that and help me understand how you got to that, that's what you intend to do. That's what I want to give people, not make it very complicated.
Ultimately, our job is to translate what worked so well on the submarine into what works and what impact that can have in every day-to-day business. So it's great to have you on board the team so you can bring that perspective into the organizations that we work with. Chuck, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. We'll look forward to continuing the conversation, I'm sure, at some point in the future.
All right. Well, thanks for having me today, Peter. If anybody ever has any questions, don't hesitate to reach out.